Hello guys, and welcome to another video. And this one we're going to be adding another entry to the Keystone highlight series, and this series aims to cover many of Path of Exile's keystones, discuss their mechanics and interactions and their use cases in various builds. And this particular video is about the keystone Veteran's Awareness, and this can only be obtained by socketing a specific unique small cluster jewel into your passive tree. And as it's a cluster jewel, it must be socketed in one of the outer sockets on the passive tree, or in a socket which extends from a medium or large cluster jewel. And once you've socketed the jewel, you'll then need to spend an additional passive point to allocate the keystone which branches off from it. And Veteran's Awareness comes from the front line, a unique small cluster jewel which drops from the Delirium bosses Omniphobia and Kosis during Delirium encounters in maps. This keystone has 3 modifiers: plus 10% to all elemental resistances and maximum elemental resistances while affected by a non-Vaal guard skill, 20% additional physical damage reduction while affected by a non-Vaal guard skill, and 20% more damage taken if a non-Vaal guard buff was lost recently. And the thing that you'll notice immediately about this keystone is that it would essentially make you stronger defensively when you're already at your strongest during the guard skill, and it will make you weaker defensively when you're already at your weakest after the guard skill has fallen off and likely while it's still on cooldown. So all of these modifiers are specific to non-Vaal guard skills, and there is currently a total of 5 non-Vaal guard skills in Path of Exile. These are Arcane Cloak, which scales with mana to grant a buff which can absorb damage, and also grants flat added lightning damage. Molten Shell, which scales based on armor to provide a buff which can absorb damage. Steel Skin and the Necromancer's Bone Armor, both of which grant a buff which can absorb damage and grant immunity to bleeding. The Bone Armor ability also affects your minions. And lastly, Immortal Call, which doesn't grant a buff that can absorb damage like the other guard skills, but instead provides a less damage taken modifier for both physical and elemental damage taken, granting higher amounts of less physical damage taken and a longer duration if endurance charges are consumed. And the buff from all guard skills will only absorb damage from hits, not damage over time. With the exception of Immortal Call, this one doesn't absorb damage, but its less damage taken modifiers will apply to all damage of those types, including damage over time. Alright, so let's take a look at the downside of Veteran's Awareness first. 20% more damage taken if a non-Vaal guard buff was lost recently. So when you use a guard skill, you gain a buff which has a duration. The buff will end when the duration expires or when the guard's shield is depleted. For example, Steel Skin provides a buff which can absorb up to 2,209 damage on a level 20 gem, and 70% of the damage you take during the buff will be absorbed by this buff before your life or energy shield. The Steel Skin buff lasts for 1.5 seconds by default, and this buff will end if the duration expires or if you would take enough damage to fully deplete the buff, ending it early. When the buff ends, the downside of Veteran's Awareness will then be active, and it will remain active for 4 seconds following the end of the buff. So you have 20% more damage taken for 4 seconds following the ending of a guard skill buff, which is quite scary. Now, guard skills are a type of skill which all have a specific cooldown tied to them, and they all share cooldowns. For example, if you had Steel Skin and Immortal Call, and you use Steel Skin, when the Steel Skin buff ends, it will go on cooldown, and Immortal Call will also go on cooldown for the same duration. Additionally, you cannot use a guard skill during the effect of another guard skill. So using the same example, while Steel Skin is active, you cannot use Immortal Call. A guard skill cooldown will only begin once the buff ends, but you can modify these cooldowns with normal cooldown recovery rate modifiers, and there's also some guard skill specific cooldown recovery rate modifiers on the passive skill tree. There's 20% on the Dynamo wheel, which is just to the left of the Scion start location, and 40% on the Adamant wheel at the bottom of the tree. The duration of guard skills can also be modified with normal modifiers to skill effect duration, and there's also some guard skill specific duration modifiers on the 2 passive skill tree wheels that I just mentioned, providing 40% and 25% increased guard skill duration respectively. The downside of this keystone is unavoidable. However, there is one guard skill which doesn't really follow all of the rules, and that's Vaal Molten Shell. This is a Vaal guard skill, and it's currently the only obtainable Vaal guard skill in non-standard leagues following Vaal Immortal Call being drop disabled in patch 3.3. So, as it's a Vaal skill, it requires souls to use, and it needs 50 and can only store a single use at a time. And of course, Being a Vaal skill, it has a soul gain prevention, which is 14 seconds compared to the 9-second duration, and this also scales with modifiers to skill effect duration, so you need to be careful with any increases to duration of guard skills that you have in your build, as this will also scale the soul gain prevention duration, stopping you from gaining any souls for this ability. Now, all normal guard skills have a skill gem fact which states that they share a cooldown with other guard skills, but Vaal Molten Shell doesn't have this line. Instead, it has the modifier, you cannot have the buff at the same time as any other guard skill. This means that you can use Vaal Molten Shell during a normal guard skill and it will immediately end the normal guard skill and replace its buff with the Vaal Molten Shell buff. So as long as you have enough souls, you're able to essentially mask the downside of Veteran's Awareness by using Vaal Molten Shell right at the end of a normal guard skill buff, so that Vaal Molten Shell's buff is active during the 4-second period where you have the 20% more damage taken modifier from Veteran's Awareness active on you. You can also consider using Frost Shield when the downside is active. This skill has very similar mechanics to a guard skill, but doesn't share any of the cooldown mechanics with other guard skills. Frost Shield drains your energy shield to grant stages of a ground area buff which will absorb the damage you take while you stand in its area. Now let's take a look at the upside of Veteran's Awareness. Plus 10% to all elemental resistances and maximum elemental resistances while affected by a non-Vaal guard skill, and 20% additional physical damage reduction while affected by a non-Vaal guard skill. These modifiers will grant a huge defensive layer against all elemental and physical damage while the guard skill is active, and it will improve the effectiveness of your guard skill massively due to the order of operations for taking damage. For example, let's say a character has 75% cold resistance, 100% chance to suppress spell damage, and is using a level 20 steel skin skill. The character gets hit by a Shaper Ball, which deals about 13,000 cold damage and has 25% cold penetration. The damage is first reduced by resistance, so 13,000 reduced to 6,500. Then spell suppression, so 6,500 brought down to 3,250. Then, Steel Skin's buff will absorb 70% of the damage before life or energy shield, so the damage will fully deplete the shield of 2,209 from Steel Skin, and the remaining 1,041 damage will be dealt to life or energy shield first if the character has any. If the character had Veteran's Awareness allocated, the character would have 85% cold resistance during Steel Skin's effect, so the damage would be reduced by resistance first, so 13,000 reduced to 5,200, and then by spell suppression, bringing it down to 2,600. Then Steel Skin would absorb 1,820 damage, and would still be active after the Shaper Ball hits the character, with 389 shield remaining. The character would then take the remaining 780 damage to life, or energy shield first if they have any. You can see how impactful the Veteran's Awareness upside is in this example. Gaining 10% maximum elemental resistances is very, very impactful. But what about a large hit of physical damage? Let's say a champion has 50,000 armor and 20 fortification stacks, and is using Molten Shell. Molten Shell's buff is based on 10% of armor up to a maximum of 5,000, so this character would cap out its buff. The champion gets hit by a Shaper Slam, which deals about 13,700 physical damage. The damage is first reduced by armor, which provides 42% physical damage reduction. So the 13,700 is reduced to 7,946. Then by Fortify's less damage taken modifier, which brings it down to 6,357. Then 75% of the damage is absorbed by the Molten Shell buff effect, so it absorbs 4,767 damage and is still active with 233 shield remaining. Then the remaining 1,590 damage is dealt to life, or energy shield first if the champion has any. If the character had Veteran's Awareness allocated, however, the armor and additional physical damage reduction combined would provide 62% physical damage reduction, bringing the initial hit down to 5,206. Then Fortify's less damage taken modifier is applied, bringing it down further to 4,165. And the Molten Shell buff then absorbs 75% of the damage, leaving it active with 1,876 shield remaining, and the champion takes the remaining 1,041 damage to life, or energy shield first if they have any. You can see how much work the additional physical damage reduction does from Veteran's Awareness here, 20% additional physical damage reduction from a single stat is kind of ridiculous, and it's practically unheard of in the current game. And this is definitely one of the best use cases for the Veterans Awareness Keystone, on a bossing build which is theoretically strong enough defensively to be able to tank the smaller abilities even with the downside of Veterans Awareness active, but uses the upside from the Keystone to tank the massive abilities using a self-cast guard skill like Molten Shell. And what about the worst case scenario? Let's say the champion's Molten Shell just ended, meaning the upside of Veterans Awareness is no longer active and the downside of 20% more damage taken is now active. The champion is hit by the same Shaper Slam, dealing 13,700 physical damage. Armor mitigates 42%, bringing this down to 7,946. Then, the 20% more damage taken modifier is multiplied with Fortify's 20% less damage taken modifier, and this is then applied, bringing the damage down to 7,628. The champion has no guard skill active, so the 7,628 damage is dealt to life or energy shield first if they have any. And you can just see from this example that improper use of this keystone is probably going to lead to some quick rips. And what about if the champion was using Vaal Molten Shell to mask the downside? Well, the Vaal Molten Shell buff would absorb 39% of the damage if it was a level 20 gem, so it would absorb 2,975 damage and will remain active with 7,025 shield remaining. And the champion would take 4,653 damage to life, or energy shield first if they had any. You can see that the use of Vaal Molten Shell to mask the downside of Veterans Awareness provides quite a considerable difference. And in a realistic scenario, it's unlikely that you'll be tanking a big boss ability immediately after tanking one with the normal guard skill, if that was your intention. And I think the general use of this keystone in an average build is likely quite unfavourable, because the downside will probably lead to a lot more problems that's not really worth the upside that the keystone brings. Overall, Veterans Awareness is a niche keystone that has its uses. In general gameplay, it's unlikely to provide much benefit, but for a tailored bossing character, it can allow the tanking of devastating abilities which may have otherwise killed the character. If you enjoyed this video, please do like and subscribe, and hit the bell to be notified whenever I post a new video. I'm trying to grow this channel and I need your support, so if you're finding my content helpful, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below the video. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.